About 40% of all Americans are considered obese. Not just overweight, but obese, defined as a body mass index of over 30. In the UK, still one of the most overweight nations in Western Europe, that obesity rate drops to about 20%. And on top of that, a recent study done in 2024 found that when it comes to health, American adults have higher levels of hypertension, high cholesterol, and worse cardiovascular health than their British counterparts. Funnily enough, when the Americans and Brits had to rate if they thought their own health was good, Americans were more likely to say yes, and Brits were more likely to say no, which wasn't reflected in the data, but that's a whole nother topic. Americans, on the whole, are much heavier than Brits. It's just a fact. And I think that you'd have to be living under a rock to not know that one of the many stereotypes about Americans that people from around the world have is that Americans are overweight. There are plenty of memes, jokes, and quotes about it, and I have to say, Americans are not unaware of this stereotype. In this case, they often are aware how they're perceived around the world. And I think it's easy to attribute a lot of this to other negative stereotypes about American culture. You might say Americans are lazy, Americans lack self-control, Americans are greedy when it comes to food and when it comes to money. But to really understand why the obesity problem in America is much worse than in the UK, and why Brits are healthier in general, we need to look deeper than the stereotypes. In this video, we're investigating the foundations of people's lives in each of these countries to see how they got there. There is a lot of individual choice that goes into every single person's life every single day, but there's also a very forceful undercurrent of the culture and socio and economic structure in which they're raised. And my argument in this video is that that can shape us just as much as eating an extra Twinkie can. Now let's start practical. Movement is something that keeps people healthy. A lack of exercise isn't going to make or break your weight if you're already eating healthy, but for many, it certainly helps keep things in check. In the UK, there's a very prevalent walking culture. Is it just because Brits love to walk? Yes. Some of them do, sure, but also Britain is much more set up for walking than many other countries. The small landmass and concentrated areas of people mean that things are much closer together. For a lot of towns, you might park in the town center and then do your shopping or errands by walking from place to place. In villages, especially, you might not even need a car. But in the US, in a lot of areas, this just isn't the case. Outside of the major walking cities like New York City and Boston, everything is so spread out that you have to drive from store to store and from errand to errand. In many areas, walking between them would be out of the question. And sure, there are plenty of places in the UK that aren't walkable, but the American driving culture developed because of how spread out it is. With a lack of other people walking around, you feel very exposed, and it's a totally different atmosphere than it feels to walk in the UK where more people are on foot. But walking and driving culture alone doesn't explain major obesity levels in America. Often, that starts with food intake. From a cultural perspective, fast food is one of the most appreciated things in America. Plenty of worldwide fast food chains like McDonald's have their origins in the US. Brits consume fast food too, by the way, and at higher rates than Western Europe, and we can see this with the amount of fast food chains available in the UK. But America still leads the way per capita in fast food consumption. And culturally, this makes sense. America values fast. We value go, go, go. We work longer hours. We take less vacation time. We are a nation of hustle and of wanting things to be as quick as possible. Our culture around eating is even different than in the UK when it comes to how long we would take to enjoy our meal. Eat a meal at a restaurant in the US and you won't be sticking around after you've finished eating. There's no talking, there's no hanging out, there's no sitting and enjoying each other's company after you've finished, because the tipping culture means that the waiter or waitress needs your table after you're finished in order to get more tips. In the UK, the pace of eating is slower. It's enjoyed more, it takes longer, and that leads to a lower rate of fast food consumption than the US. Americans also eat out more often. While costs are rising everywhere, it's still cheaper to go out and get food in a restaurant in America than it is comparatively in the UK. I also find that many Brits consider going out to a restaurant to be reserved for something special. Maybe a get-together with a friend that you haven't seen, or some sort of occasion like a birthday or date night, but it needs some sort of reason. In America, we're much more used to eating out just because. We don't really need a reason. Our culture is to enjoy food out at restaurants more in our average week than in the UK. And unfortunately for American waistlines, when you do eat out, you're likely consuming more calories than if you ate at home. And eating out at restaurants on its own is really not a problem to me. People sometimes think that I put down Americans on this channel, and that's not it at all. I actually prefer the American culture of how often we go out to eat. I find it fun, it breaks up the week, and it's how things like American diner culture thrive. You don't win any sort of moral points for how often you eat at home versus at a restaurant, but it does make it much more difficult to manage food intake and to not get carried away. But the American obesity problem goes deeper than just not walking and eating more often at restaurants. There are much more sinister things underneath the surface. Firstly, food lobbyists. The American government is not just run by politicians, but by lobbyists who essentially work on behalf of various industries to get laws passed on things that benefit them. And food and drink lobbyists are the same. These industries, with their dollars, are swaying government policy on everything from taxes on junk food to advertising laws to the number of food additives allowed. It's no surprise to many that food regulation laws in the US are much less strict than in the UK, and there's been a real push in the UK in recent years to try and actually push back against bringing in American style, i.e., more lax regulations surrounding food. There are so many chemicals in American food that are banned in the UK. Some of these include potassium bromate, which is used in bread and is linked to cancer, an additive called BHA that's a flavor enhancer and food preservative that comes in everything from fast food to cereal, and there's also plenty of synthetic food colorings that are potentially linked to behavior changes in children and possible changes to your DNA. And on top of that, America is one of the only countries in the whole world that doesn't really restrict advertising junk food to children. The number of ads you see in the USA for all types of junk food specifically geared towards kids is staggering. A lot of my favorite ads that I can remember as a kid all have to do with food. The Trix Bunny Rabbit, Captain Crunch's cereal ads, and Fruit Gushers, which are sort of like a sugary gummy, had some very memorable ads geared towards kids. On the flip side, the UK is actively trying to stop advertising junk food to kids and has just recently introduced laws surrounding advertising junk food on television between the hours of 5:30 a.m. and 9 p.m. and online at any time. There's a whole range of restrictions depending on the food, though companies can still advertise healthier versions of their products or advertise their brand without specifically mentioning individual junk food products. Now, the American mindset on this would likely be that this is unfair to the companies who should be allowed to profit off their junk food sales, and certainly in the upcoming administration, I would bet anything that we won't see any bans on junk food advertising in the USA. And again, I actually do think these are more complex issues than I think sometimes my videos have time to go into. I am interested in the debate between what governments should be allowed to ban regarding advertising and how this is decided, because there's also room here for discussion. But it all plays into the overall picture that we're creating here to understand why Americans are so much more obese than Brits. Another area that impacts health, including weight, is healthcare. Not just specifically for weight loss, but having access to a doctor throughout your life. Even if you don't go to the doctor for help with your weight, it's very much noticed. They might bring it up as something that could be causing your bad back, or you might come in for something unrelated and they might point it out to you and ask if you've thought about tackling your weight issue to bring you to a better overall level of health. The point is, healthcare access is important for everyone, and many in the US don't have it. If we think about what happens in the US without something like the NHS, each doctor's visit for many people has a price tag attached. So yes, if you have the correct and high quality insurance, maybe you do maintain good health in the US, but those without will have much fewer doctor's visits because they can't afford them and are only seen by medical professionals for emergencies. And that piles up over a person's lifetime. I think it's easy to say, well, I don't need a doctor to tell me I'm overweight. And that's a fair point, but it's more about the overall structure and inequality when it comes to healthcare access that allows an obesity epidemic to thrive. And finally, there's a much higher level of social and financial safety net in the UK compared to the USA. There's social housing in the UK, more benefits for those in need, and just an overall level of help from the government in the UK that does not exist in the US. The rich are very rich in the US, but the poor are very poor, and there's a massive gap between them. It's been proven that poverty and low income levels lead to poorer eating habits. Even if fast food weren't cheaper than eating healthy food, which it typically is, cooking for yourself also requires an amount of time that those struggling may not have. That's not to say that there aren't low income people in every country. The UK has its share of people who've fallen on hard times or are living in poverty or are not well off for whatever reason. And those people too in the UK are more likely to deal with health issues and to be obese. But the problem is less in the UK than it is in the US, and the inequality levels in the UK are much narrower than in the USA when it comes to things like access to healthcare. So what happens is all of these things pile up. The lack of walking due to the infrastructure, the food lobbyists, the lack of regulations when it comes to junk food, the unequal access to healthcare, and less of a safety net when it comes to social benefits, and you've now created a society in which it's easier to become obese, in my opinion, than in the UK. This video is in no way talking about any individual person or talking about the details of weight gain or loss or the level of personal responsibility required. My point is more cultural, because people are people, and people often aren't just born with certain traits. A baby is a baby, whether it's American or British or Chinese or Swedish or whatever. But the baby is impacted throughout its entire life in the culture in which it's raised. And that's how we get different populations that all seem to have things in common. They're all raised in a similar culture, and the American culture, for the reasons that I've gone over, seems to be one where problems with obesity are easier to come by. Now that brings me to the end of this video. I hope I've given you some food for thought, pun completely intended. Leave your comments as always down below. Let's get the discussion started. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.